Welcome back, coders, and hope you're doing great and you're continuing to code. So in this video, I'm talking about the hook UseContext. Now, what is UseContext? UseContext is a way to manage state globally. Now, it can be used with UseContext can be used with useState to share state between deeply nested components more easily than with useState alone. So UseContext helps to share state with components that are deeply nested. But the thing is this: if you don't see the problem or the tiresome of why you need UseContext, you may not be able to appreciate UseContext. So I'm going to create a scenario here. So let's import useState from React. After importing useState from React, let's create a what? Let's create a component. So we're going to create a function component, and then we're going to call it component 1. Component 1. So my component 1 is simple. I'm going to create my state here in the component, and the state will be user. Then I'm going to say set user. Then I'll equal to useState, and then the user here, I'm going to pass is Henry. So the user, I'm going to pass Henry local. So that is the user. So after that, I'm going to put a return function. So I'll have to return some HTML. So the return of the HTML. So then in that, I'm going to have to define my wrapper. Then in my wrapper, I'm going to define my h1 tag. After defining my h1 tag, in the h1 tag, I'm going to say hello. Define hello. Then in the hello, I'm going to pass in the user variable, then exclamation mark, save. Then after that, I'm going to pass in component 2. My component 2. So I've not yet defined component 2, so I'm going to define component 2 down the line. So I'll say component 2. And my component 2 will have an attribute of user. So the component 2 needs the user that I've defined in component 1. So it will equal to, let's say, user. This user that I've defined. So now I can close my component 2. Now I need to now make component 2. To make component 2, I can say function. Then I'll make my component 2. My component 2. Then my component 2 should take in the prop of component 2 that it's taking in is the user prop. Then it should return something. So let me say return. Then after return, make my wrapper. After making my wrapper, then component 2 should just have a h1 tag that says component 2. Component 2. Now, but in this case, component 2 does not need the user. It passes it on to component 3. So probably we shall say component 3. Then we say user will equal to user. So we pass. Remember, the user state is defined in the what? Component 1. We pass it to component 2. Component 2 does not need it, and component 2 we pass it to component 3. So now we have to create component 3. Let's see this. We have to now create component 3. So we create our component 3. Copy this. We create our component 3. Let's say component 3. This is component 3. Then what component 3 does, it passes it to component 4. So we now need to create our component 4. So we create our component 4. says I'm component 4. Now component 4 does not use the user, it passes it to component 3. When passes it to component 5, so we have to create our component 5. So what component 5 does, it says hi, I am component 5, so we can now remove this, it's not passing it. Now it's component 5 that needs the user state. So what component 5 will do, it will just say hello. It will say hello user again. So we save, then we should pass here, the component we should pass here should be component 1. Should pass in component 1. We save, everything should be working well. So you can see this hello, then component 2, component 3, component 4, then component 1, component 2, component 3, component 4, component 5, then component 5 is on that says hello Henry again. So you can see that these components are nested. The component that needs the user state is component 5, right? But the user state is defined in component. Is defined in component what? Is defined in component 1. But component 1 does not call component 5. The only component that calls component 5 is component 4. And component meaning that now we need to pass the user state down the nest. So we need to pass the user state to component 2, and component 2 passes it to component 3, then component 3 passes it to component 4, which has access to component 5. Since now user 4 has component 4 has access to component 5, then component 5 can access it. So now this is the problem. Now what they call this is called prop. They call it prop drilling. When you, that's the technical name, prop drilling, whereby you pass components from when you pass your state from one component to another. It's like as if you're prop drilling, like property drilling. So there's a way to solve this. Now to solve this, you can use the context, the use context prop. So to solve this problem, you can use the use context. You can use the use context hook. Now to use the use context hook, first we need to create our context. So we shall have to import our create context. Import our create context from React. After importing our create context, then we need to create our context. So to create our context, we shall say const. We shall say const user context. So const user context will equal to create context. So then we have created our context. So after creating our context, we go to component 1, the main component at the top of the nest, which is component 1. When we reach component 1, we now have to nest component 1 into our user context. So to nest component 1 into our user context, we can say user context dot provider, user context dot provider. Then in this nest that we are nesting of our top component, we can pass in now the value to it. So you can pass in the value as user. So after passing our value to our nested component, then you can close our user context dot provider. After closing our user component dot provider, now there we have nested. Our what? Our top level component. So after nesting our top level component, in component 2, so component 2 now no longer needs user, because the component that needs the user is component 5 in the nest. Since we have nested our top level component, it means that all the components are nested under the user. They're nested under the user context dot provider. So it means that component 2 we don't need to pass in the what? The user. It means here in component 2 there is no property of user that is going to come. Then component 3 also the same thing, we don't need to pass in the user. Component 3 we don't need to pass in the user. Component 4 we don't need to pass in the user. Component so 4 here we don't need this. Component 5 we also don't need that. Then also in component 5 we also don't need that. So now to access our user, what we do, you come to whichever component in the nest you want to access user. So when you come to the component you want to access user, you come here and say const user will equal to, then you now have to import UseContext. So you come here on the top and then import UseContext. So after importing UseContext, you go to the component where you want to get access to the state, and you can put UseContext. Not that user context, it says UseContext. So after passing in the UseContext, then inside the UseContext you have to pass in the context that you created. So you pass in the context that you created. So here should not be user context, it should be UseContext. So after that, everything should now be working well as before. So you can see everything is working well as before and there are no bugs. It means that now these components that don't need the user state, they don't need to pass it down the nest. So you just go to the component that actually needs the user state, and then what? When you go to the component that needs the user state, then you can now store that user state into the user variable or whatever variable you have created. Then to get access to the user state, what you say UseContext, then you pass in the context that you created. You pass to the UseContext the context that you created, which has been wrapped around all the components, so the top level component that is nesting all the other components. So that is how you use UseContext. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you understood, leave a like, subscribe, and see you in the next